The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War had its roots in the Truman Doctrine and containment. Divided after France was defeated in 1954, Vietnam became, in JFK's words, the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, the keystone in the arc, and the finger in the dike against the spread of communism, and in LBJ's words, a fight for American principles. The United States paid a huge price for its determination to turn back communism in Indochina. More than 58,000 Americans died in a war that only deepened divisions at home. Kennedy had greatly increased the number of military advisors and special forces in South Vietnam, but it was Johnson who made the decision to engage the United States in a major war there. Throughout the winter and spring of 1964, as conditions grew steadily worse in South Vietnam, Johnson and his advisors prepared to launch a sustained bombing campaign against the North. After a probably false report of 2 attacks against U.S. destroyers by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin, Congress voted a resolution authorizing Johnson to defend U.S. forces and prevent further aggression. Ironically, Johnson campaigned in 1964 with a call for restraint in Vietnam. Safely re-elected and fearing the Saigon government was near collapse, Johnson chose to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam to avoid a disastrous and humiliating defeat. In February 1965, Johnson used a Viet Cong attack on Marines in Plaikao to justify Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing of the North. Accepting the Army's premise that a combination of artillery, air power, and ground forces would grind down the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in a war of attrition, Johnson authorized a steady buildup of forces, reaching 165,000 troops by November 1965, with more on the way. From the air, millions of tons of bombs and defoliants destroyed the countryside, while search and destroy ground missions made refugees of 4 million people. While advisors urged LBJ to explain his policy to the American people, LBJ hesitated, fearing it would undermine his domestic reforms and led to a course of intentional deceit. Scenes of human suffering and devastation recorded by television cameras increasingly undermined the administration's moral justification of the war as a defense of freedom and democracy in South Vietnam. After a critical report on a ground operation against South Vietnamese village of Cam Ne by CBS News, Morley Safa in August 1965, President Johnson complained bitterly to the news director. The print media also questioned Johnson's policies when Harrison Salisbury, a Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter, charged that U.S. planes had bombed the population center of Hanoi, capital of North Vietnam, and intentionally ravaged villages in the south. A strong supporter of the Cold War, Senator J. William Fulbright, concluded that the war was unwinnable and destructive to domestic reform and urged a negotiated withdrawal. As the costs mounted, Johnson convinced Congress to levy a 10% individual and corporate tax surcharge, but inflation surged, fed by the cost of the war. Johnson replaced advisors who questioned his policy, but as casualties multiplied, more and more Americans began to question his handling of the war. As the war in Vietnam escalated, Americans from all walks of life protested U.S. involvement. But in 1965 and 1971, a peace movement took shape that had a distinctly generational character. This so-called 60s generation, the largest generation in American history, brought together by SDS activism with music, dress, and hairstyles as the Flower Children, rejected their elders' authority and formed an increasingly insistent anti-war movement. In the fall of 1964, students returning from Mississippi at the University of California at Berkeley began protesting Bay Area discrimination. When the university president cracked down on protests, students launched a free speech movement in defiance. A planned takeover of the administration led to 800 arrests. Mario Saivo, a Freedom Summer volunteer and philosophy student, defended the free speech movement, seeking more than political activity, but an end to rules that treated students as children instead of adults. As a string of campus protests, mostly large universities, including the University of California, relinquished in loco parentis in place of the parents' policy and allowed students to live off campus and set their own hours. Across the bay in San Francisco, other young adults staked out a new form of community, a counterculture. During the 1967 Summer of Love, 75,000 young people flocked to Haight-Ashbury for a music and drug-fueled be-in. The generational rebellion took advantage of the birth control pull, embraced free love and communal living. Drugs from marijuana to LSD, promoted by Harvard professor Timothy Leary, let youth turn in, turn on, drop in, and drop out. Music inspired and reinforced youth rebellion as Bob Dylan and a wave of folkies and rockers warned parents that the times there are changing. All these forces converged in a 3-day Woodstock Music Festival in New York in August 1969, where the Woodstock Nation took drugs, stripped naked, and made love on the grass. Even if hippies were a small minority and the good vibes were short-lived, the anti-war and counterculture sentiments of a generation came together in the slogan, "Make love, not war." At the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, more than 3,000 students turned out for anti-war protests in 1965. Teach-ins spread across American colleges and to Europe and Japan. And an anti-war march in Washington, D.C. attracted 20,000 people. Students demanded an end to on-campus war-related research, and receiving no response from administrators, turned to civil disobedience. Students chanted Sieg Heil to the police, who attempted to disperse them with tear gas and mace as protests broke out on campuses across the nation by 1967. In April 1967, a day-long anti-war rally in Manhattan's Central Park drew more than 300,000 people. While some burned draft cards or refused induction, others sought to bring the war home, raiding draft offices. More than 40,000 bombings or bomb threats through 1970 damaged $21 million in property and killed 43 people. The average age of those who fought in Vietnam hovered around 19. Working-class young men, disproportionately African American and Latino, signed up in large numbers as the military promised vocational training and social mobility, whereas college graduates constituted only 12% of the 2.5 million men who served in Vietnam and the 9% of those who were killed in combat. High school dropouts were the most likely to serve in Vietnam and by far the most likely to die there. The casualty rate for African Americans was approximately 30% higher than the overall death rate for U.S. forces in Southeast Asia. Some African American soldiers openly complained about being asked to fight a white man's war and emblazoned their helmets with slogans like, "No gook ever called me a nigger." The nature of the war fed feelings of disaffection in the armed forces. Moreover, American forces seemed to benefit little from their superior arms and air power. Vietnam veterans returned to civilian life quietly without fanfare, denied the glory earned by the combat veterans of previous war. Tens of thousands suffered debilitating physical and mental injuries. The 1960s civil rights movement spurred a new concern with poverty. Building on Kennedy's legacy, Johnson pledged to expand anti-poverty programs, pushing the most ambitious reform program since the New Deal through Congress. Ironically, violence at home as well as abroad ultimately undercut his aspiration to wage an unconditional war on poverty. The cornerstone of Johnson's war on poverty was the Economic Opportunity Act, enacted in August 1964. An Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, coordinated community-based self-help programs for education and employment with only mixed results. While the community action programs in theory empowered poor local officials such as Chicago Mayor Richard Daley fought with the OEO over funding and control. Educational programs proved more successful. VISTA, or Volunteers in Service to America, a kind of domestic Peace Corps, brought several thousand idealistic volunteers into poor communities for social service work. Legal Services Program attorneys helped millions of poor people in legal battles with housing authorities, welfare departments, police, and slumlords. Comprehensive community health centers provided basic medical services to poor patients who could not afford to see doctors. Upward Bound helped low-income teenagers develop the skills and confidence needed for college. Birth control programs dispensed contraceptive supplies and information to hundreds of thousands of poor women. Spending on social welfare jumped from 7.7% of the gross national product in 1960 to 16% in 1974, but barely scratched the surface of the problems as 3/4 of new spending went to the non-poor. Johnson raised expectations unrealistically, as his programs could not be fully funded while the war dragged on. As the post-war building boom transformed the suburbs, the housing stock in the nation's cities deteriorated. Race-based redlining policies marked off poor neighborhoods, denying residents access to mortgages and building loans. City officials used federal funds under the 1949 Housing Act for middle and upper-class projects, and new urban expressways cut through poor neighborhoods and disproportionately displaced minorities. Urban employment opportunities declined along with the urban housing stock. While overall unemployment declined, black unemployment twice that of the whites, and those who had jobs were relegated to the low-paying service sector. Despite deteriorating conditions, millions of Americans continued to move to the cities, mainly African Americans from the Deep South, white people from the Appalachian Mountains, and Latinos from Puerto Rico. By the mid-1960s, African Americans had become near majorities in the nation's decaying inner cities, where conditions would soon bring urban pressures to a boiling point. Between 1964 and 1968, more than 100 cities exploded in violence. Throwing rocks and bottles through store windows, rioters in Watts in August 1965 shouted, "This is for Selma, this is for Birmingham, and burn, baby, burn." After 6 days, 34 people lay dead, 900 were injured, and 4,000 more had been arrested. Los Angeles police blamed civil rights agitators. The mayor accused communists, and both feigned ignorance when the media reported that white police assigned to Charcoal Alley, the name for the Watts district, had for years referred to their nightsticks as nigger knockers. The following summer, urban riots broke out in San Francisco, Milwaukee, Dayton, and Cleveland. On July 12, 1967, in Newark, New Jersey, a city with severe housing shortages and the nation's highest black unemployment rate, the beating and arrest of a black taxi driver by a white police officer provoked a widespread protest that led 25 dead. A week later, Detroit police raided a bar to arrest after-hours patrons, leading to a week of rioting, 34 dead and 7,000 arrests. In July 1967, President Johnson created the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders to investigate the cause of the riots. The Kerner Commission blamed racism, poverty, and police brutality for the nation's movement toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Yet the growing costs of the war left little money to fight poverty. America was fighting two wars and winning neither. The urban uprisings of the summer of 1967 marked the most drawn-out violence in the United States since the Civil War. 1968 proved worse. Americans lost faith in U.S. invincibility in world affairs, and disillusionment deepened when two of the most revered political leaders were struck down by assassins' bullets. While protesters and police clashed in the nation's campuses, city streets, and millions of Americans asked what was wrong with their country. Unrest spread abroad, with students and workers taking to the streets of Paris. Soviet tanks crushed Czechoslovakia's Prague Springs, violent protests in Mexico, and the Cultural Revolution roiled in China. On January 30th, 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive, named for the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday, stunning the U.S. military command in South Vietnam. U.S. troops halted the offensive, suffering comparatively modest casualties of 1,600 dead, 8,000 wounded, compared to the 40,000 North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong losses. As many as 1 million South Vietnamese became refugees, their villages totally ruined. Television and press coverage of savage fighting in Saigon and Hue dismayed the public. The United States won a major military victory but lost the war at home as support for the war in Vietnam and Johnson's popularity alike plummeted. Meanwhile, in Rome, Berlin, Paris, and London, students and others turned out in huge demonstration to protest U.S. involvement in Vietnam. After Congress rejected General Westmoreland's call for more troops, Johnson went on TV in March 31st to announce a bombing halt and a willingness to negotiate an end to the war. His presidency in ruins, he shocked the nation by declaring he would not seek another term in office. By 1968, the civil rights leadership firmly opposed the war, and Martin Luther King Jr. had reached a personal turning point. Under relentless FBI harassment and facing threats from FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover, who swore to destroy the Burhead, King abandoned his customary caution in criticizing U.S. policy in Vietnam and broke decisively with Johnson and liberal Democrats. In the spring of 1968, King chose Memphis, Tennessee, amid a sanitation strike to inaugurate a Poor People's Campaign for Peace and Justice. On April 4th, 1964, at 6:05 p.m., he stood on the balcony of his motel. King was shot and killed. He was shot by James Earl Ray, a 40-year-old fugitive who there have been questions about James Earl Ray's guilt, but he died in 1998 in a prison in Nashville. There is a likelihood that he did not act alone. Throughout the world, crowds turned out to mourn King's death. Former SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael stormed, "When white America killed Dr. King, she declared war on us." Riots broke out in over 100 cities, on college campuses, and at American bases in Vietnam. Chicago Mayor Richard Daley ordered his police to shoot to kill, and machine guns were set up outside the White House in the Capitol. King's dream of the nation as a beloved community died with him. Liberals dissatisfied with Johnson's conduct of the war, and for African Americans suffering the loss of their great leader, turned to New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy. The race for Democratic nomination pitted Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy, a witty philosopher who shared his opposition to the war, against the charismatic Kennedy. McCarthy appealed to liberal Democrats and white suburbanites, while Kennedy reached out successfully to African Americans and Latinos and took the lead in the primary race. But after winning the decisive California primary on June 4, 1968, Kennedy was assassinated by Palestinian-American Sirhan Sirhan, a self-appointed assassin who claimed RFK must die. Incongruously calling his campaign the politics of joy, Vice President Hubert Humphrey emerged as the only credible Democratic nominee. Courting Democrats who grimly supported the war and the King-Kennedy wing, which was sickened by it, Humphrey also cultivated the Democratic power brokers. Without entering a single state primary, he lined up delegates loyal to city bosses, labor leaders, and conservative Southern Democrats to lock up the nomination. Still reeling from the riots following King's assassination, Chicago's Mayor Richard Daley refused to issue parade permits to protesters at the Democratic National Convention. Daley's strategy boomeranged when his officers staged what a presidential commission later termed a police riot, randomly assaulting demonstrators, casual passers-by, and television crews filming the event. Angered by the embarrassing publicity, Daley sent his agents to raid McCarthy's campaign headquarters, where Democrats opposed to the war had gathered. Inside the convention hall, a raging debate over a peace resolution underscored the depth of the division within the party over the war. When Senator Abraham Rubikoff of Connecticut addressed the convention and protested the Gestapo tactics of the police, television cameras focused on Mayor Daley saying, "You Jew son of a bitch, go home." While the American anti-war movement picked up steam, Protests spread worldwide as young people demanded an end to the war and democratic reforms. The Republican contender, Richard Nixon, deftly built on voter hostility towards youthful protesters in the counterculture, appealing to a silent majority of taxpayers and peaceful workers. Although Johnson enjoyed a landslide victory in 1964, his conservative Republican rival, Barry Goldwater, had trumped him in several states in the Deep South. And as Johnson knew, civil rights legislation had antagonized the South. While Nixon employed a Sunbelt strategy appealing to Southern whites and courted the religious right, third-party candidate George Wallace appealed more openly to angry white conservatives and captured 5 states and 13.5% of the popular vote. Nixon squeaked victory with the popular vote, but split the East and Midwest with Humphrey and won nearly all the West for a convincing electoral vote margin.